Lobster Lake, Maine, 1891. A mysterious creature lurks in the northern Maine woods. Baffling residents and hunters looking for the day's hunt encounter something that they couldn't even imagine. An animal that they are quite familiar with, but different than any they have witnessed before. A creature all white in color, with some witnesses claiming it wasn't real at all, but rather a ghost or spirit, capable of vanishing into thin air and even resurrecting itself back from the dead. Was this a story of the ultimate hunting trophy, or rather an image of the untameable wild? What sparked the flurry of sightings deep in the Maine wilderness, and is there any truth to these reports? Is this creature an unkillable towering figure of Northwood's legend? Or rather, is there a more rooted explanation? Today, on Unblurring the Unknown, the legend of the Specter moose. Welcome back to Unblurring the Unknown. I am your host, Dominic, and I am back with another cryptid episode. I think it has been... I did the Van Meter Visitor, so I decided to go back down the cryptid route. Kind of had a couple things pop up this week. Kind of had to throw together an episode a little bit on the fly for you guys. But I had researched this topic before in the past, and I was kind of just waiting on a good time to throw it all together. And as I dug deeper into this topic, the more I got into it, and it was something that I had, like I said, I did a little bit of prior research on this way back when, and after digging deeper into it, it really kind of captivated my attention, because something like this, to everybody who lives up in the Northeast like I do, I've never heard of this. And somebody who frequents Maine quite often, I haven't heard any of my friends up in Maine talk about this. So this is a very interesting topic. I got really deep into this one. There is a lot to this topic. There's a lot of sightings. There's a couple different instances and descriptions, more or less, of what this animal cryptid, whether you want to classify it as a cryptid, that's up to you. I think it does fall under the realm of cryptid. So that's what I'm going to call it. But nonetheless, as well, I want to wish everybody a happy new year, and I hope everybody's Christmas and holidays went well, and you saw plenty of family, and you also got incredibly drunk, because that's the point of these holidays, is because you don't want to spend time with your relatives, so you get drunk. That's the point of them. Now, the idea of having a colossal animal, such as a moose, and then, obviously, listening to the stories of the Specter moose, having an animal that's even bigger than regular moose proportions is incredible. And to add on the reports that this animal has been reported to shy off gunfire and come back from the dead, like, is there any truth to any of these reports? So that is what I want to delve into today. So how today's episode is going to be laid out is that I'm going to kind of explain this region of Maine, in which a big chunk of these sightings take place. Although, I won't get super deep into this specific region of Maine, because I explained a little bit about northern Maine history in the Allagash abductions episode. And so I'm not going to go super deep into that. Then after that, I will go into the story of the Specter moose and sightings, and then I will wrap everything up at the end with theories. So with that being said, let's get into it. Now, where the very first sighting of the Specter moose takes place is at Lobster Lake, and in the unincorporated area of northeast Piscataquis, Maine. Now, if you are unfamiliar with Maine, a lot of places in Maine are named after Native American words. Now, if I butcher the pronunciation of any of these Native American words, I do thoroughly apologize. However, Maine has a lot of them, so I do want to apologize if I mispronounce anything over the course of this episode. Just want to get that out in advance. Now, this unincorporated area of northeast Piscataquis, Maine, which resides in the county of Piscataquis. This county is situated right below Aroostook County, which is suitably known as the county to many Mainers. Northeast Piscataquis, which has a total area of 1,820.4 square miles, and according to the 2020 census, there are only 347 full-time residents of this area of Piscataquis County, which roughly equals out to 0.2 inhabitants per square mile. So kind of think about that for a second. That's pretty remote. Median income per household in this area is only $31,250. Overall, a not very wealthy and extremely remote area of the country. Now, the town of Williamsburg used to exist in this area, but was dissolved in 1940 due to a lack of population. Williamsburg was located 17 miles north of the county seat of Piscataquis County, Dover-Foxcroft. Now, that is a little kind of snippet of this kind of area where a majority of the Specter moose sightings have taken place. Now, what does a Specter moose look like? Now, the Specter moose is described as 10 to 15 feet tall, all white and sometimes gray in color, weighing roughly 2,500 pounds, and with an antler wingspan of roughly 12 feet across. Now, average moose can get anywhere from 800 to 1,500 pounds, so if this moose is real, this would be a moose of world record proportions. Now, the first sighting of the Specter moose takes place in 1891 around Lobster Lake. Now, Lobster Lake is named because the lake conveniently looks like two lobster claws. On the left side of the lake, if you're looking at it from a map, looks like the little claw of the lobster, whereas the right side of the lake looks like the bigger claw of the lobster. Just kind of a fun little interesting tidbit I found. Now, hunting guide Clarence Duffy, who's from Old Town, Maine, while out in the wilderness, he describes what he saw around Lobster Lake as a massive white moose. He did see the creature plainly, and it wasn't obstructed from his view, so he knew what he saw. Although Duffy wasn't close enough to take a shot of the moose, he was shaken by the encounter. He later told this story to family and friends, who didn't believe him and kind of laughed at him. Said, like, there's no way you saw this. This makes no sense. You're crazy. Now, like I said, many took this first sighting as a joke, and it wasn't until a few months later, after Duffy's encounter, a lumberman from Bangor named John Ross also saw a giant white moose around Lobster Lake. Now, the legend of the Specter moose had begun to grow in the area, and that same year, another sighting took place, this time from a hunter from New York. The hunter was hunting around the area near Nesauda... Oh gosh, I'm so sorry. I told you, I'm going to mispronounce these words, and just brace for it. And if you looked at the name of this lake, you'd probably mispronounce it too, so I started it. Nesauanahunk? I'm going to go with that. Near Nesauanahunk Lake when he saw the animal. The New York hunter fired several slugs from his gun into the animal, with none of them appearing to injure the animal. All of what it did was piss it off. The moose charged the hunter, and he fled and escaped by hiding in a bear cave. Now, maybe that's not the best spot either, hiding in a bear cave, because it's like, what do you want to deal with? The giant colossal white moose that's charging you, or the bear you probably pissed off by getting into the cave? But, nonetheless, that's not the point. The hunter hid there for about an hour until eventually the moose left, got bored, and kind of walked away. Now, the next sighting of the Specter moose would occur a year later, in 1892, when another New York hunter, Howard Van Ness, would witness the creature. His sighting takes place roughly 30 miles northeast of Norcross, which, after doing some looking, would put him around the Sherman, Maine area in Aroostook County, and not Piscataquis County. Van Ness was hunting with 3 other hunters when he somehow got separated from the group. How he got separated from the group was not really explained in any of the articles I found, just, moral of the story, he got separated from the group. While out on his own, he said to have come across the Specter moose. He described the animal with the following quote: "Weighed a ton and as tall as a camel, with magnificent head and antler. Close quote. Now, Van Ness obviously shot at the moose, to which this also had no effect, and all it did was anger the moose. It let out a grunt of anger and charged Van Ness, who took cover underneath some fallen trees and tangled brush. After waiting under there, eventually the angered beast left and Van Ness was able to basically escape. Now, this would be the third sighting in a year, and at this point people actually started to seek the animal out, probably for a variety of reasons. Maybe some wanted to see if the reports were true, whereas some wanted the fame and possible fortune that came with killing a gigantic moose with a white hide. Now, the moose wasn't seen again until 1895, when a taxidermist named Granville Gray spotted the moose from a distance. Now, location was not provided for this encounter, so I couldn't find it, so I'm not really sure, I guess, credibility. I'm always skeptical on reports that don't provide name, or don't provide location, or don't provide date, because it's like, are you just making up the story, or do you not want anybody to find the possible hunting spot you were in, or where you found it, because you want to go back and shoot the white moose? I don't know. There's a variety of reasons. However, I always don't like to believe reports that come from unnamed locations, but that's besides the point. After this sighting in 1895, it wasn't seen again until 1899. This time by Gilman Brown, who was from West Newbury, Massachusetts. He was up around the Roach River and saw the moose. He was able to get up close enough to count 22 points on only one side of the antler. So obviously moose have two antlers, one on each side of the head, and if he was able to count 22 points on only one side of the antlers, you're talking about a absolutely colossal animal. Now, normal moose have only 8 to 12 points on average on one side of the antlers. Now, Gilman Brown did take his gun out and shot at the monstrous animal, to which the bullets had no effect on the moose. And now, fast forward to 1906, George Nealon of Sherman would have his own run-in with the Specter moose. Now, George Nealon this time was not a hunter, so this was probably the first time where he wasn't seen by a hunter. It's not really elaborated on whether the taxidermist, Granville Gray, was hunting at the time, but I have to assume he possibly was. Now, this is the first time the moose is seen by somebody who's not a hunter, and George Nealon was riding his bike on the roadway between the stretches on the road between Sherman and Macahawk when he saw the moose. The moose was startled by Nealon's presence and charged Nealon. George Nealon ditched his bike and climbed up a nearby tree for safety, and after the moose inspected Nealon's bike and calmed down, the animal walked into the forest and seemingly vanished from view. Now, following Nealon's encounter, there would be short waves of sightings in the 1900s, notably in 1917, 1932, and again in 1938. I could not find that many documented reports during these rash of sightings, however, all the articles I read did mention these. The New York Times reported on the Specter moose again in 1938, confirming another influx of sightings, this time in the Chesuncook Forest region in between the Chesuncook and Moosehead Lake along the west branch of the Penobscot River. Now, the New York Times mentioned the Specter moose in 1938, but it's important to note that the first ever publishing of the Specter moose in the New York Times is actually 1899, and the Boston Globe also picked up on this story, so this wasn't a localized incident. There was big newspapers reporting on what people were seeing in Maine, and I think that lends a little bit of credibility to the entire thing, that newspapers such as the New York Times and even the Boston Globe were picking up this story and running with it. This idea of this giant colossal moose that is in the Maine wilderness that is virtually unkillable. Now let's get back into more sightings, because there is more. In one report from 1938, a unnamed hunter claimed to have seen the white moose grazing with other moose. Now, the size of the animal was significant, and according to the hunter, it made the other moose, and this is a quote, look like pygmies, close quote. When the hunter turned his eyes away for 1 second and turned back, the white moose had seemingly vanished from thin air without a trace. And lastly, perhaps the most mysterious and baffling account of the Specter moose comes from a group of hunters that were hunting around the Molunkus stream. This group of hunters claimed to have killed a large white moose fitting the description of the Specter moose. After hauling the animal back to their camp, they slit the throat of the moose and hung it up from a tree overnight so that they could finish dressing it in the morning. And if you're asking yourself, why would they do that? This is because you have to remove the trachea and esophagus of the animal along with the guts and internal organs to gather the hide of the animal, as in field dressing. And most likely, they perhaps wanted some blood to drain from the animal to reduce its weight before they cut it up in the morning. Also, leaving excess blood in the carcass would cause the meat to spoil. And obviously, if you killed a moose, your main goal is to eat the meat. You do not want the meat to spoil and basically ruin your whole 3 weeks worth of meat that you'll get out of a moose. Now, besides that quick little hunting tidbit, when the hunters woke up in the morning, the white moose was gone. Its carcass had seemingly disappeared from the camp entirely. That following night, the moose had seemingly come back to life as it just happened to walk through the camp with its throat still cut. The reanimated corpse of the giant white moose was a clear shock to the hunters, who tried to kill it again, to which their weapons had no effect. Now, the Specter moose has gained some traction of being a omen for something bad to happen, as locals reported seeing the moose in 2002 in the town of Franklin. Shortly after the sightings of the moose were reported, the town's restaurant burned down, leading locals to make the connection that perhaps the moose is an omen of bad things to come or a bad symbol of some sort. Now, was there any evidence to support the existence of a gigantic white moose that stalks the deep Maine woods? That would be yes or no. The idea of the moose being some sort of supernatural entity remains very much a stretch of the story in some instances. However, white moose are very much possible in nature. Now, the first instance of there being a white moose, and for it to be all white in color, would be the moose being albino. That would be the most likely explanation, but the other is another skin condition known as leucism. Now, leucism is just a partial loss of the pigmentation of the skin, whereas being albino is all white. Leucism doesn't usually lead to the animal being all white, like I mentioned. However, an albino moose, all white, is extremely rare. 1 in 20,000 rare. You have a better chance of being struck by lightning than seeing an albino moose, and that is an actual fact. You can Google it. That is an actual fact. You have a better chance of getting struck by lightning than seeing an albino moose. Now, albino moose seem to have a higher population in parts of Canada and Sweden, and they are protected in much of Canada. They hold significant roles in the culture of Indigenous peoples in Canada. Labeled as spirit moose, they are viewed as watchful guardians over the land, and it is illegal to hunt them. In 2013, in Nova Scotia, the Micmac tribe actually charged 3 hunters with the killing of a protected white moose and ordered the safe return of the animal's pelt, which they did get back. Even though there is a hotspot of a population in Canada and Sweden, being albino for an animal in the wild is not a good thing by any means. Having all-white skin makes them more vulnerable to predators such as wolves and bears, as they can no longer blend in with their surroundings. They are also at higher risk for skin conditions such as skin cancer, as their bodies are not producing melanin to protect them from UV rays, and albinism also leads to vision and hearing problems, making it more difficult to navigate their environment and find food. Those are all big cons to being albino in the wilderness. It is not actually a good thing whatsoever. Now, with that being said, would it be possible for an albino moose to even grow to that type of proportions where it's already kind of dealt half a deck of cards, so to speak? That kind of remains up for debate. However, there is also another reason of why a moose hide would turn lighter in color, and this is from a condition that biologists have found. Now, biologists have coined this term ghost moose, which refers to a moose that has been infested with large amounts of ticks. Ticks, if you don't know what they are, if you live anywhere in the woods, you should know what a tick is. Ticks are a parasite, and because of their nature, when draining blood from the moose loses much of its body mass. And to try and get the ticks off of them, moose will rub their bodies and hair on pretty much anything they can find, which removes a lot of hair from the moose and also thins out and lightens up their coat. Now, because of the lack of hair and lack of hair color, and the size decrease from the ticks basically sucking the animal dry of blood, this basically leaves the animal as a gaunt, grayish skeleton of what was this giant, majestic animal. However, due to the size decrease caused by ticks, I don't think that this would be a realistic explanation of what the Specter moose is, because the Specter moose is not described as being a skeleton of any sort. It's described as being 2,500 pounds. That is nowhere even close to what a ghost moose looked like. However, I think it is important to provide that fact as well. So that leaves the question, what really is responsible for the sightings of the Specter moose up in Maine? Now, with that being said, I'm going to get into the theories section now. Now, I have 3 theories, and all of them make a little bit of sense, and at the very end, I'm going to conclude on what I think my personal theory is. Now, the first theory, and possibly the most realistic, is that the moose is albino. Now, somehow this moose has lived, and a population of albino moose have developed a stable-ish population in the area, perhaps. Canada has a hotspot, so it's not outrageous to think this. However, the sheer size of the animal reported casts its doubt, as I mentioned before. Would an albino moose even live or grow to the size of the one described? The largest moose ever recorded was in Alaska, and it weighed 1,808 pounds. The Specter moose is a projected 2,500 pounds. So, it would be very difficult for an albino moose to grow to that size, as I mentioned before, with it having natural disadvantages to living in this area. Now, pre-1900s hunting of moose in Maine, moose were very scarce as they were hunted profusely, as there was no hunting season. Hunters were hunting them left and right. There was no season. There was all these other things that was going on. So you didn't need to register any moose. People were just shooting moose willy-nilly, so the population dipped. So to even see a moose in and of itself is possibly rare in and of itself. And then you add on the part of it that a 2,500 albino moose, 2,500 pound albino moose, is living in the Maine wilderness and has not been shot or killed by the hunters of the area, is pretty rare. Just the size is pretty rare. But nonetheless, I'm going to move into the second theory. Now, the second theory is it possible that the Specter, in the name of the Specter moose, could be that this moose is in the form of a ghost? Now, as I mentioned before, it was not a secret that pre-1900s Maine had no laws on moose hunting. Many hunters would hunt moose strictly as market hunters in an effort to kill the creature and then sell the meat for a large cash payout. Could this be that a moose was killed so gruesomely it created a spiritual attachment to this area? That is also not unheard of, as there are stories of ghost animals that haunt certain areas because of an attachment to this certain area. However, people and locals have reported that the reason that the Specter moose is called the Specter moose is not because it is a ghost, but it is because of its all white and sometimes gray coloring. But it's kind of interesting to think about the ghost explanation, because maybe there is a little bit of evidence to support that, with the moose seemingly vanishing into thin air, and then obviously the story that comes from the Molunkus stream, where the hunters killed the moose, and then it somehow resurrected itself back from the dead and walked through the camp and seemingly had no effect to gunfire. So there is some credibility to that. However, I think that it still might be a little bit of a stretch. Now, the last of the three theories is that this is a hoax. Maybe this was just a made-up story to foster the idea to moose hunters of this ultimate game animal that was stalking the woods of Maine. And that could be a maybe. But with the accounts coming from all over, and not just from unnamed hunters, I don't know if I fully buy this theory either. I think if it was a hoax, you'd have a few isolated encounters, possibly from people who were working together, to maybe drive tourists to this area, but even then, I don't know. Like, you're talking pre-1900s, people are already going up to Maine to moose hunt anyway, as there is no regulations on them. And the idea of killing a moose and then selling the meat for a lot of cash is pretty appealing in and of itself. So, why would you need any more motivation to go up there? Possibly if somebody created this story of this gigantic albino moose, it would bring more hunters to the area. It would create this idea of, like I mentioned, this ultimate game animal, this ultimate trophy. If you were to kill the giant white moose of Maine, you would be an absolute legend. But that's really it. Like, there's not really like any other evidence to support that, even though it is a pretty good selling point. There's not really any evidence to say that that happened. Now, lastly, with my theory, and my theory is a combination theory. Now, I think that the Specter moose was real, in the instance that this was a real albino moose whose size was possibly inflated for the idea of painting this story as, like I mentioned, the ultimate game animal in the woods. Could there be a spiritual aspect to this, like the ghost theory, especially from the story of the moose coming back from the dead? Maybe, but maybe that was also the local lore feeding off the real evidence of the creature. I believe there is always some sort of truth behind any local legend, and it's kind of only a matter of figuring out where the truth ends and the embellishment starts. However, I do believe that this was possibly a very large albino moose that lived for many years in this extremely remote area of the Maine wilderness, and once saw by human eyes, took on a life of its own in the eyes of the public, and it took on this life as a ghostly white monster of an animal, as a symbol of the ultimate trophy, or rather, the untameable wild. Now, I'm going to stick to that theory, and I feel pretty strongly about this theory, is that there's a good chance that this was an albino moose, and its size was inflated for local lore, local legend, and so on and so forth. I know I just said that there's not a whole lot of evidence to prove that it was a hoax either, but I think there's a little sprinkle there. Like I mentioned, I think when you're talking about local legends or local folklore, there's always a little bit of truth. And I think the little bit of truth in this instance is that this was a real albino moose, and that somebody did see this albino moose, and it took on a life of its own in stories and so on and so forth. And it's not unheard of for moose to live decades upon decades, so that is not outside of the realm of question. However, could that explain these sightings past 1938? I don't know, because people still have said to see it past this 1938, throughout the 1900s, and even in the 2000s, so could there be a small pocket of population of albino white moose, or could this still be some type of gigantic white monster of a moose that is still out there? I'm not quite sure. But I think my theory is a very plausible one, and I'm going to stick to it. I'm going to stick to it, I'm going to stick my feet in the ground, and I'm going to stand right there on it. But with that being said, that is going to pretty much conclude today's episode on the Specter moose. Please tell me how you like it. Tell me in Spotify how you enjoyed it. Tell me in the comments on YouTube whether or not you enjoyed it. And with that being said, I'm going to do my obligatory plugs here. And a little extra fact, what I did for you folks this week is I actually took all of the reports that I found in articles, and I actually put them on a Google Maps screenshot map of this area in Maine, and I will be posting that to my Instagram so you can see the full map of reported sightings that I have mentioned in this episode. And the sightings that maybe didn't make it into the episode, but I also found in my research. So I wanted to let you all know that I did put that together for you folks, and it was very interesting. You can see that all of these sightings take place relatively in the same area, with an exception to just a couple, but most of the reports that I found in my research all took place within a very concentrated area, which kind of lends some evidence to something like this existing. But with that being said, I mentioned Instagram. Go follow me on Instagram, Unblurring the Unknown. On Instagram, I will be posting pictures and photos relevant to this week's episode, including the map, like I just mentioned, on there as well, so please make sure you go and check that out. And if you are listening to this on Spotify, I am also available on YouTube. Please go ahead and subscribe to me over on YouTube so you get notified every time I post a new episode. And if you're listening to this on YouTube and you have Spotify and you're like, oh, he's got Spotify, go follow me on Spotify, turn on notifications so you get notified every time I post a new episode so you don't miss any of them. And on top of that, I also take topic suggestions. I have a growing list of topics right now that I've just found through pure research. But if any of you have topics out there that you would like to send me, please send them to me at my email. That is unblurringtheunknown@gmail.com. I will say that again, unblurringtheunknown@gmail.com. Send those on over to me. It helps me out a lot, and I greatly appreciate it. But with that being said, that is going to conclude today's episode on the Specter Moose. Like I said, I hope you all enjoyed it. A little bit out there, maybe a story not everybody has heard of, but it's definitely an interesting one. So again, let me know how you think. And with that being said, I will see you on the next one.